You have exactly 1 week to get rid of those animals, or you'll be sorry. Karen bellowed. The day I moved into Sunny Hills Estates, I was optimistic. Sure, an HOA-controlled community could be strict, but I wanted a quiet, picturesque neighborhood where I could retire and finally indulge my lifelong passion. Rescuing and fostering animals, primarily cats and dogs, but occasionally the odd hedgehog or rescue turtle. I'd recently lost my mother, a longtime veterinary technician, and I intended to honor her memory by helping neglected animals find better lives. Sunny Hills looked perfect, well-manicured lawns, neighbors who made polite small talk, tree-lined streets echoing with cheerful birdsong. My real estate agent had mentioned a diligent homeowners association. The name rang alarm bells, but at the time, I shrugged it off as typical real estate jargon. Diligent meant well-organized, right? That was before I met Karen Littleton. She was the HOA president, but everyone simply called her Karen. Rumor had it she was the one-woman judge, jury, and enforcer of the strictest guidelines in all of East County. The day I arrived, she popped up on my porch, beaming with a forced politeness. Welcome to Sunny Hills. I'm Karen, the president of our homeowners association. Let me give you a brief overview. She thrust a folder at me, bulging with papers. To be fair, I tried to read them, but a massive binder of bylaws read like a foreign language. Terms like architectural compliance, window dressing policy, and lawn ornament limitation peppered every paragraph. I skimmed for something about animals. All pets must be registered, it said in tidy bullet points. No more than 2 domesticated animals per household. Not ideal, but workable, especially if I planned carefully which animals to foster at any given time. I didn't want to cause trouble. I simply wanted to help. I settled in with my 2 golden retrievers, Dolly and Jolene, feeling confident. Over the next few weeks, I worked on the house, painted the front door a cheery teal, after the appropriate form submission, of course, and introduced myself to neighbors while walking Dolly and Jolene each morning. People seemed friendly enough, until Karen appeared to greet me, unannounced, with an unexpected list of correction requests. Hello again, she chirped. I noticed some lumps in your backyard. Are those animals? Perhaps fosters? I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Yes, I replied gently. I'm fostering a few cats who needed temporary placement from the local shelter. They'll only be here until they find forever homes. Karen pursed her lips. That's unfortunate. We have a strict limit. And for the record, you must also ensure that your fosters do not pose a nuisance to neighbors. She shot me a tight-lipped grin. I'll be checking in soon. I said nothing, just nodded politely as she stepped off my porch. But something about her tone left me uneasy, as if I were a suspect under surveillance. Within days, I discovered I wasn't the only one. My next-door neighbor, Arlo, had a parrot he'd inherited from his father. According to Arlo, the bird was like a family heirloom. However, Karen had slapped him with a noise violation because the parrot squawked at 6 a.m. The retired schoolteacher across the street had her grandchild's bunny for a weekend, and Karen complained about unregistered livestock. This was no ordinary neighborhood watch, and Karen was no typical busybody. She was methodical, always carrying a notepad to jot down infractions, then cross-referencing them with the HOA's massive tome of rules. Things came to a head the first time I tried to make use of my newly built cat enclosure. I'd spent weeks carefully constructing an enclosed outdoor space so the foster cats could safely get fresh air, no chance of wandering on a neighbor's lawns, no aggravating yowls in the night. It was built with solid netting, well within property lines, and I'd followed every requirement about structure, color, and design. But that didn't deter Karen. I see you've constructed an unapproved extension, she said, appearing by my fence like a ghost. We'll need to schedule an inspection. Also, we're updating the rules about exotic and multiple pets. You want to be there for the vote. I opened my mouth to protest. Exotic? They were just cats. But Karen turned on her heel, hurrying away with a pointed stare that said, I'm watching. At that moment, something inside me solidified. I'd had enough of living in fear. Sure, I'd never asked to become a rebel, but I also wasn't about to watch a bully strip away my right to help innocent animals, especially ones that needed temporary homes. But I'd soon find out that Karen's mission went well beyond a gentle nudge to follow the rules. She had an agenda to transform Sunny Hills Estates into the pristine, pet-free fortress of her dreams. And if I stood in her way, she would make me pay. The talk of a rule update about animals spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. No one could pinpoint its origin, but all signs pointed to Karen. Rumor had it she was proposing a near-complete ban on pets, cats, dogs, birds, rabbits, you name it, any animal that wasn't strictly for medical service. Even fish tanks were rumored to be on the chopping block. At first, I thought it was just alarmist gossip. A complete ban was outrageous, not to mention unenforceable. But as the weekly HOA board meeting approached, I noticed a shift in people's attitude. Neighbors who once waved hello now hurried inside, or changed the subject if I mentioned the upcoming meeting. I realized they were intimidated. Karen had them convinced that supporting any animals beyond her narrow guidelines meant fines, drama, or neighborhood ostracism. I refused to be scared off. The evening of the big vote, I arrived at the HOA clubhouse with my notes in hand, dressed in a conservative cardigan and slacks. Trying to look calm and collected, I stepped into the fluorescent-lit room. About 20 chairs faced a long table where 5 board members sat. At the center was Karen, neatly coiffed hair and a stack of papers so tall you'd think we were deciding nuclear policy. She began with a clack of her pen against the table. Good evening, everyone. We have several items on the agenda tonight, starting with the matter of the new pet policy. She unfolded a typed, multi-page proposal. Given the rising concerns regarding noise, property damage, potential allergens, and general disruption, the board suggests limiting all households to 1 pet, with no fosters or unapproved species allowed. Violations will result in an immediate $200 fine and possible legal action. A stunned hush settled. One gentleman tentatively raised his hand, clearing his throat. Karen, I've lived here 12 years. My wife and I have 2 cats and a dog. We keep them indoors, and no one's ever complained. Karen offered a tight smile. I'm aware, Carl. This is not personal, but we must consider the well-being of the entire community. I stood, gripping my notes so hard my knuckles whitened. Karen, I volunteer at the local shelter. We're already dealing with overcrowding. If we close our doors to fosters in this neighborhood, you're putting countless animals at risk. She tilted her head condescendingly. We appreciate your empathy, but we must prioritize people. Allergies, noise pollution, sanitation issues, these are real concerns. We can't allow a free-for-all. But she cut me off, addressing the room in a louder voice. Also, I have learned that certain residents are operating makeshift rescues in their homes. That's not what Sunny Hills is about. We're here for peaceful living, not a zoo. I could feel eyes on me. The temperature in the room seemed to skyrocket. Though furious, I forced myself to speak calmly. Karen, with all due respect, you're painting this in the worst possible light. Responsible pet ownership shouldn't be demonized. If there are specific complaints, let's address them individually. But a blanket ban? One board member, a silver-haired man named Tom, interjected. Could we consider a compromise? Maybe more oversight instead of an outright ban. Karen's polite veneer cracked a bit. She flashed Tom a look that could have melted steel. We could discuss it, she said curtly. But we also must ensure everyone follows the rules. I've already compiled a list of property violations related to pets. They range from unapproved fences to unlicensed animals. This problem is bigger than you realize. I stood my ground. I'd like a copy of that list. As a concerned resident, I'd like to see if any of those so-called violations are legitimate. Karen's lips thinned. Requests must be submitted in writing. We'll see if the board deems it necessary. The tension in the room was palpable. Some neighbors averted their eyes, while others seemed too scared to speak up. Karen moved on to the next item on the agenda, landscaping color palettes, and hammered through each point like a machine. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to table the pet ban, pending further discussion. That meant no immediate resolution, but the fight was far from over. Walking out of that clubhouse, I realized I had to rally the community. Karen wasn't going to back down on her own. I spent the next few days chatting with neighbors, letting them know that a total ban was not only extreme, but also possibly illegal. Some of them, particularly the ones with long-time pets, seemed grateful to know they weren't alone. Others were too scared to sign any petition for fear of retribution. During one of these door-to-door conversations, I met Mrs. Garner, an older widow who lived at the end of the street. She had a small cat named Picasso, a companion she'd rescued after her husband passed away. Tears welled in her eyes when I explained the potential ban. "My cat is the only reason I get out of bed most days," she whispered. "Without him, I'd be so lonely." That moment steeled my resolve. This wasn't just about fosters or even my personal passion for helping animals. It was about people, neighbors who depended on their pets for emotional support and companionship. But as I grew more vocal, Karen's efforts intensified. One morning, a stern letter arrived in my mailbox. It bore the HOA letterhead and threatened an official inspection if I didn't register every single animal on my property within 48 hours. I tried to comply, only to find the official forms for registration were nowhere to be found, unless I paid a $50 administrative fee to Karen directly. Frustrated, I left messages with Tom, the more sympathetic board member, but never heard back. Soon after, a rumor started circulating. I was a troublemaker who brought in diseased strays. A neighbor confided that Karen was behind the gossip, telling people my fosters were feral animals that could bite children. The more she spread misinformation, the more I worried the neighborhood might turn on me. So I devised a plan. I'd host a small weekend open house. I'd invite anyone curious about my fosters to come see their clean enclosures and meet these sweet, well-behaved pets for themselves. I wanted to show them we had nothing to hide and that my fosters were not the monsters Karen implied. What I didn't anticipate was just how far Karen would go to sabotage my good faith gesture, and how quickly everything would blow up in her face when her scheme unraveled. The Saturday open house was a simple idea: coffee and homemade pastries in my backyard, plus a chance to meet the half-dozen foster cats comfortably lounging in their sunlit enclosure. I also invited my neighbor Arlo, encouraging him to bring his parrot, though caged, so folks could see it wasn't a screeching menace. Mrs. Garner promised to pop by with some brownies and her cat, Picasso, safely harnessed and leashed. As the day approached, I distributed flyers around the neighborhood, bright, friendly, featuring pictures of the cats. I even posted a polite invitation on the HOA's official online forum, hoping to dispel rumors. The response was cautiously positive. A few neighbors emailed me privately, glad I was hosting such an event. But then the messages started turning odd. People wrote apologizing that they couldn't come because of urgent errands or sudden scheduling conflicts. I sensed Karen's influence. Perhaps she was telling people to avoid my open house, or worse, threatening them with fines if they attended. Nonetheless, Saturday morning arrived, sunny and mild. I set out fresh coffee, donuts, and the cat enclosure sparkled with new netting. Dolly and Jolene, my golden retrievers, dozed by the patio furniture, greeting every guest with a tail wag. To my relief, a handful of neighbors did show up. Arlo came carrying his parrot, which squawked only once, and even that was more amusing than alarming. Mrs. Garner, trembling slightly, arrived with Picasso in a carrier. 2 other families came by out of curiosity, armed with questions about fostering. I was in mid-conversation, explaining how fosters are screened for medical issues, when a commotion erupted near the driveway. A tall man in a crisp polo marched up, brandishing a clipboard. Behind him was none other than Karen, arms folded, face pinched in a self-satisfied smirk. "Excuse me," he announced. "My name is Peter Hawkins. I'm an inspector contracted by the HOA. We received a complaint of multiple code violations occurring here today." My pulse thumped in my ears. "This is a private gathering," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't have permission to search my property." Karen stepped forward. "Actually, the HOA bylaws state that if a resident is suspected of violating neighborhood rules, the board may authorize an inspection to protect the community. Don't worry, we'll be thorough." Mrs. Garner's face went pale. Arlo's parrot let out a nervous squawk. My fosters pawed at the enclosure walls, sensing tension. I took a deep breath. Fine. I have nothing to hide. Let's see about that, Karen replied, sweeping past me toward the cat enclosure. She and Peter hovered around, snapping photos, checking for structural code compliance. They measured the wood beams, tested the latch on the cat door, and scribbled notes. Every so often, Karen made loud remarks like potential hazard here, or I see signs of overoccupancy. They moved on to Dolly and Jolene, checking collars and tags. Then they turned their attention to Arlo's parrot. Clearly an unregistered exotic, Karen declared, raising her eyebrows. Arlo stammered, I've had him properly licensed for years. We'll need proof of that, Peter said, pen tapping ominously on his clipboard. Mrs. Garner stood by quietly, hugging Picasso's carrier. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. By this point, the few curious onlookers who had come to see the Fosters were more like spectators to a showdown. Karen marched back to me, chin high. I'm sure the board will agree that multiple citations will be filed. Unapproved structural modification, possible violation of the pet limit, and hosting an unauthorized public event. I steeled my expression, refusing to let her see I was rattled. Nothing here is unauthorized. I followed all the guidelines for a private gathering. We're not blocking any roads, and my Fosters are well below the property limit for Fosters. Karen's voice pitched higher. The board is still deciding on the Foster rule. Until then, it's a gray area, and you're in violation. That was the moment Tom, the sympathetic board member, walked through the gate. He'd apparently heard about the open house and decided to drop by, just in time to witness Karen and Peter's theatrics. Karen, he said calmly, I don't think we have grounds for half of these violations. You're overstepping. She looked stunned, as though a piece of her carefully orchestrated puzzle had just fallen out of place. Tom, we need to ensure compliance, she insisted. It's my duty. Tom turned to Peter. I'm a board member, and I wasn't informed of this so-called inspection. Under the bylaws, formal inspections need at least 72 hours notice to the resident. Did you provide that? Peter paused, flipping through his papers. Karen assured me everything was in order. For the first time, Karen looked unsure. The onlookers murmured amongst themselves. Tom crossed his arms. It doesn't appear there's any legitimate violation process here. I suggest we stop harassing our neighbor and sort this out at the next meeting. Karen's expression shifted from confidence to indignation. She opened her mouth to argue, but then clamped it shut. Peter shrugged, apologized, and slipped out the gate, clearly not wanting to be caught in the crossfire of a potential legal fiasco. As he left, Karen huffed, We'll see about this. Mark my words, and stormed out behind him. A collective exhale passed through the small crowd. Mrs. Garner's eyes gleamed with relief, though her hands trembled. I'm so sorry this happened, I told her softly. I never wanted to cause drama. She squeezed my hand. You didn't. Karen did. Tom approached me, looking uneasy. We need to talk, he said quietly. Karen's pushing the board to adopt her ban in a closed meeting. She says it's for the health and safety of the community. But I see no reason we can't push back. We just have to be smart about it. I nodded, feeling equal parts gratitude and worry. Karen had stooped to new lows, arranging an illegal inspection, and she'd likely stop at nothing to push her ban through. But Tom was offering help, and I knew we'd need every ally we could get. I glanced at Dolly and Jolene, who'd taken the chaos in stride, and at my Fosters, now peeking out from their enclosure. There was a fight ahead, but I wasn't about to give in. Not with so many lives at stake, both the animals and the people who love them. 2 weeks later, the closed meeting took place. It was closed in name only. Under the HOA's own regulations, any member could attend, but Karen made sure it wasn't widely publicized. Tom, however, tipped me off, armed with a thick binder of evidence, photos of the Fosters, letters from neighbors and support, a statement from the local shelter praising my volunteer work. I arrived at the conference room, ready for battle. Inside, Karen sat flanked by 3 other board members. Tom was there as well, looking tense. Karen stacked a thick set of documents on the table and cleared her throat. Let's begin. Tonight's single item, the proposed Pet Protection and Community Safety Act. What a name, I thought, stifling an eye roll. She really knew how to spin her ban into something that sounded benign. Karen launched into her pitch. We've had numerous complaints about noise, unsightly structures, and potential health hazards posed by multiple pets. This proposed rule would limit each household to one pet, with exceptions only for certified service animals. No fosters would be permitted, as these transient animals pose the greatest risk. This is for the betterment of Sunny Hills. She handed out typed copies to the other board members. They paged through it, some nodding uncertainly. Before she could continue, Tom raised his hand. I'd like to hear from the community members. He gave me a small, encouraging nod. I stood, smoothing out my notes. My name is Maria Gibson, and I foster animals here in Sunny Hills. I have letters from neighbors. Karen interrupted with a mirthless laugh. Yes, from the few who haven't complained, perhaps. I took a measured breath. Actually, I have letters from many residents, including some who rely on pets for emotional support. Mrs. Garner, for example, lost her husband and has found solace in her cat. Others love their dogs as cherished family members. We shouldn't punish everyone because of a few alleged complaints. Complaints, by the way, that no one seems able to produce any written record of. Karen bristled. Noise complaints aren't always written, Ms. Gibson. Well, they should be, Tom interjected. That's standard HOA procedure. Complaints need documentation. I pressed on. Moreover, Karen claims fosters are a health hazard, but I have a letter from Dr. Berman at the local animal shelter. It attests to the rigorous health checks fosters receive. They're vaccinated, dewormed, and well-monitored. I laid the letter on the table. Where exactly is this health hazard data coming from? Karen grabbed a pen, scribbling something. We don't need every fact in black and white. Residents have a right to feel safe. Not everyone wants to live next to a rotating cast of stray animals. One more thing, I said, pulling out a small packet. A reference to the original Sunny Hills covenants, conditions, and restrictions from 1988. There's a clause that specifically allows for fostering under certain conditions. It was added by one of the founding members who ran a rescue. It's never been revoked. So your ban would directly conflict with the original CCR documents. A stunned hush fell over the table. Karen's eyes flickered with anger, but she forced a smile. Well, times change. We can vote to override outdated clauses. One of the other board members, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, flipped through the packet. Karen, do we have the authority to override this portion of the founding documents without a community-wide vote? Karen hesitated, then said, yes, if it's in the best interest of the community. Tom shook his head. Actually, we need a 2/3 majority of the entire HOA membership to amend a founding clause. It can't just be a board decision in a closed meeting. Karen's forced composure cracked. She started flipping pages in her own binder, clearly searching for something. We can hold a special vote. If the community doesn't come out to vote, the board's majority stands. People rarely attend these things, so it'll pass. At that moment, the door opened, and to Karen's surprise, and mine, dozens of neighbors began filing in. Word had gotten out, likely through Tom and a few other sympathetic residents. Arlo was there, Parrot perched quietly on his shoulder, along with Mrs. Garner, holding a small framed photo of Picasso, as she didn't want to traumatize her cat by bringing him. Carl, the gentleman who had 2 cats and a dog, showed up with a thick folder of veterinary records. Even a few folks I'd never met entered, glancing at me with supportive nods. Karen's face reddened. She cleared her throat, tried to regain control. We'll be holding this special vote next week. Since the matter is urgent, we are scheduling it for 8 a.m. on a Wednesday. If residents can't make it, too bad. Immediately, murmurs of protest rose. That's not fair. We work. You're trying to exclude us. Tom spoke up firmly. We need to make it accessible. A weekend or evening time, with proper notice for all. That's how these matters are fairly decided. Karen shot him a look of pure venom. But at this point, the tide had turned. Neighbors were calling for a weekend vote, demanding transparency, and pointing out all the flaws in Karen's ban. It was chaos, and Karen couldn't stem the flow of dissenting voices. Seeing the writing on the wall, she tried one last tactic. We're done here. Meeting adjourned. She snapped her binder shut, stood up, and banged the table with the gavel. But no one moved. Instead, Tom calmly took the gavel, looked at the other board members, and said, "All those against adjourning?" Hands shot up across the room, board members and residents alike. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of crimson. She opened her mouth, but only a strangled squeak came out. Then, in what felt like a bizarre performance, she stormed around the table, pointing her finger at me. "This is your doing. You've turned everyone against me." I stood there, stunned but resolute. "No, Karen, they just don't want your outrageous ban. It's not personal. We can all coexist with animals if we act reasonably." Her voice rose to a near shriek. "You're forcing me out. You're..." She took a step back, looking at the sea of faces no longer under her thumb. Then, in a huff, she whirled around and marched toward the door. Papers fluttered out of her binder in her haste. A tense silence followed, broken by the soft flutter of those papers and the parrot's quiet mimic, "Outrageous ban! Outrageous ban!" drawing a ripple of awkward laughter. The remaining board members looked at each other, shaken. Tom cleared his throat. "Let's properly schedule a full community vote. It'll be in 2 weeks, on a Saturday at noon. Everyone will get a fair chance to voice their opinion." Over those next 2 weeks, Karen was strangely absent from the neighborhood. Some said she'd taken a vacation. Others suspected she was sulking. We carried on, ensuring every resident knew about the official vote. When voting day arrived, the turnout was the largest the HOA had ever seen. People voted overwhelmingly against Karen's proposed ban. In the end, the board offered a revised approach, reasonable guidelines that enforced responsible pet ownership, but explicitly allowed fostering. Karen never fully recovered her iron grip on the community. Eventually, she quietly resigned from the presidency, citing personal reasons. As for me, I continued fostering dogs and cats, making sure to follow all legitimate rules. Arlo's parrot remained a cheerful presence on the block, entertaining neighbors with its chatter. Mrs. Garner still had Picasso, who often sunned himself by her living room window. With Karen's reign of terror over, Sunny Hills Estates felt more welcoming, more compassionate, more alive. And that, dear reader, is how one determined HOA Karen tried to impose her crazy animal ban, and how a community that truly cared about people and pets rejected it. In the end, standing up for what's right brought us closer together than we ever thought possible. If you take one lesson from this saga, let it be this: don't let bullies rule your community. Stand up, stand together, and remember, every voice matters.